I'm Jim Michael. I'm a senior advisor at CSIS with the Program on Prosperity and Development. It's my privilege today to introduce Rick Samans, a distinguished economist who's written a terrific book, Human-Centered Economics, The Living Standards of Nations. In this book, he analyzes how fundamental reform in economic policy and practice can improve the ability of societies to become more safe, more just, and more prosperous with inclusive participation and access to benefits and opportunities. If members of the audience have questions, you should be able to enter them either on the CSIS website or on the YouTube. Rick, welcome to CSIS and congratulations on this really thought-provoking and impressive book. Please tell us how you came to write Human-Centered Economics and about the central idea that it conveys.
Thanks very much, Jim, and thanks also to CSIS for the opportunity to have this conversation today. I have been working in and around different aspects of economics and its intersection with other issues that people often consider separate from or maybe adjacent to at best, like social issues, labor issues, environmental questions, development issues, and the like. And I have noticed over the years that there's a growing disconnect between the core mental model of economic growth and development, macroeconomics, on the one hand, and what people are expecting, and indeed how they assess the performance of their national economy. You know, we are trained as economists primarily to think about how to improve productive output, to expand the size, the quantity of economic activity, often measured by GDP, which people are familiar with. And that's very important and indeed crucial, particularly for poverty reduction. But most people evaluate how well their economy is doing, not by GDP statistics, which are rather abstract and an indirect measure of what they really care about, which is their living standard, which is to say, you know, how is their household faring in key dimensions of their lived experience and how their community is doing in the same. And certainly the two are related. But the link between the two, the relationship between the two, is not lockstep, and economists know that. But moreover, it's been weakening in many respects, particularly in countries that now have enough economic activity, enough wealth of a nation, as Adam Smith would have put it, that the issue is at least as much how people are able to participate in the process and the benefits of that growth. And that is sort of addressed by the field in a residual way. It's not a core explicit element by and large. There's an implicit assumption in economics that's rarely ever really interrogated in depth, and that is that basically the best way to promote broad-based sustainable improvement in living standards, which is what people want, is to enlarge the size of the pie, to increase the quantity of growth. And in my experience around research, politics, policy advice, management of institutions, I am increasingly uncomfortable with that disconnect. And you need only look at the political promises that leaders have made in the last decade or so, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, the recent Biodiversity Agreement, certain other agreements and commitments that have been made with respect to labor issues and whatnot. And you see this widening gulf between those promises on the one hand and the delivery on the ground, and at the same time you see how this disconnect is feeding an erosion of social cohesion. It's contributing to political polarization in rich as well as poor countries. And my sense is, you know, whereas for the last 15 years, we've had many statements of commitment by leaders to address this. And we've had lots of interesting initiatives to measure this problem better, beyond GDP it's often called. and lots of individual initiatives, many of them very interesting and very useful. But obviously we're not addressing this, and we're not succeeding in addressing it at scale. And my basic thesis in this book is that if we want to move from that type of incrementalism and expressions of aspirational intent to actual scaled change in terms of social inclusion, environmental sustainability, and human and systemic resilience in the economies, we've got to go back to what I call the source code of capitalism, which is liberal economic theory on the one hand, and the analysis, advice, and assistance provided by international economic organizations, which has a huge influence on what is done, particularly in developing countries, which is the majority of countries around the world. And so that's what the book seeks to go about doing. It interrogates that assumption, that trickle-down assumption. Where did it come from? How did it develop? Does it need to be? Is this something that's ordained, as just a fact of life? Or did it develop and can it be reversed? And so I propose a series of changes in theory as well as policy to indeed try to move us onto a more scaled course toward addressing these bottom line social concerns.
Let me ask about that disconnect that you mentioned. I was intrigued by the rigor and the depth of your historical analysis, in which you show that economic thinking has really evolved, that in the 18th and 19th century there was a more integrated notion in which living standards were a part of macroeconomic thought. But over time the emphasis has become more on the production and the growth and less on the distribution and on the institutions that foster sustainability and resilience and inclusion. So I wonder, do you think that we are now in a position where we're recognizing that disconnect and there are good prospects for doing something about it?
Well, thank you for bringing up the historical aspect of this. I know it can perhaps seem a little distant, to think about the 18th and 19th century founders of the field, a little distant from the current circumstance. But I think it's quite important.
They seem to know something that we may not have remembered.
Something has happened along the way. The focus that you just mentioned, I like to call it sort of a two-track or two-lens way of looking at the economy that was explicit in the writing of Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Alfred Marshall. And these were three people who basically were the leading theorists and codifiers of the field. Their tomes basically framed the pedagogy of economics for the first 150 years of the field. And they each, if you go in, as I do in the book, you go into their writings, they each have sort of a two-lens way of looking at the economy and what needs to be done. The one is markets. They were pioneers in the role of markets as a better form of resource allocation within economies that then leads to a larger quantity of productive output, of economic activity. And indeed, that remains crucial, particularly for countries that are particularly poor. But they, at the same time, were emphasizing that economies need an institutional underpinning, institutional infrastructure in a wide range of policy domains that are necessary to help ensure that the process of better resource allocation and factor accumulation, investment in capital and labor, translates into wider opportunity for employment, as well as improved diffusion of the benefits of that process of the expansion of the national economic pie. And I go through the book in quite a lot of detail with direct reference to their actual language that indicates that's the case. What's interesting is that each of these three men were moral philosophers before they were economists or economic analysts, both literally and figuratively. They were looking at the world and at their field as just a means of progressing the human condition, of improving social welfare more broadly in society. And we have lost that a bit because and I go into the book and I explain a little bit of what happened in that journey that led us that way. But let me just try to sum it up by suggesting maybe using a business analogy, believe it or not. In a business, managers are used to understanding that they have a top line and they have a bottom line. You got to grow the top line, which is sales and revenues, over time if you want to have any real prospect of improving the bottom line, profits, over a reasonable period. The analog in the economics field is the top line is growth. It's true, you need an expansion of the economy, productive output, more resources and whatnot. Over time, if you really want to have a prospect of improving the bottom line, which is improvement in household living standards at the median. But there are different things, and there are different ways, different tools you can use to optimize to, and there's a relationship between them. Sometimes there are synergies, sometimes there's a negative or vicious synergy between the two. And these original political economists, as the field was called in that day, they understood that. And they went to lengths to explain how focusing on those institutional underpinnings and labor protection, social protection systems, infrastructure, ways of ensuring that wages keep track with productivity and meet a living wage level so people have enough at the median to be able to buy a normal basket of goods and be able to better themselves. Education and skilling institutions, security, both on the environmental side and economic side. There are areas of policy and institutional deepening that need to go along as part and parcel of your growth and development model, not as an afterthought, not as a trickle-down eventual outcome of the growth process, which is the sort of the logic that is baked into our current model. And so that's the basic notion that I'm seeking to resurrect in here by formalizing that ecosystem of different institutions and policy incentives and institutional capacities in these various domains, and internalize that in the growth and development model, which is to say, internalize it in macroeconomic theory and in the way we conduct economic policy.
You know, it's striking that Marshall, for example, lays it right out, and it's very explicit. And in some more recent works, you don't see that same analysis. So that is kind of a puzzle, isn't it, that we seem to have lost the balance. Now, in this regard, you mentioned that economics is related to other disciplines that you mentioned, political and environmental and so on, and others have recognized that there is a multidimensional quality to how societies develop, but they haven't explicitly put it into the macroeconomic context that you are looking at. And I wonder how you distinguish between human-centered economics and things like Amartya Sen's idea of development as freedom, and Mahbubul Haq's human development notion, because they're looking at these human qualities and aspirations, but they're not putting it into the macroeconomic context in the same way that you are suggesting.
Yes, Sen has had a huge influence on the field, particularly with respect to the way we think about poverty reduction strategies, because he took the field beyond the kind of production orientation of, basically factor accumulation, specialization, and the like, and said, look, you've got to look at it from the human perspective, and that is capabilities and agency. And indeed, there's been a lot of work, including the UNDP Human Development Report and related work that looks more at aspects of living standards, of the lived experience of people. But again, it's been mainly focused on poverty reduction and poor countries in this regard. But I do credit particularly Sen as being one of the pioneers of what I call human-centered economics in this regard. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that the problem goes deeper. I think Sen is one of the only people who penetrated in his interrogation of the logic of neoclassical economics, which is about utility of choices at the margin when faced with scarce options or resources, if you will. He's one of the few who penetrated it, but it didn't quite go to the what I call the operating system of macroeconomics more generally. And that's what I've tried to do here, so that it would have relevance for countries at every level of economic development. And it's particularly important because today most of the poor people in the world live in middle-income countries. And even in advanced countries like this one in the United States, you can see most people are more focused on these dimensions of how their living standard is faring. For example, here in the States right now, real wages is a real problem because of inflation and price increases and the cost of things like education, healthcare, and the like. This goes to the kitchen table, to the budget, right? This is a much more concrete way of looking at things than looking at GDP statistics. So what I've tried to do is to map 5 different main channels or dimensions of household living standards, and then map the corresponding areas of public policy and institutional features that can influence that. And by doing so, by having that more formal approach to it, I call that a system. It's actually an ecosystem generally. And in economics, you would call that a function. And so I add to the standard approach to macroeconomics that everybody who's been through undergraduate economics would be familiar with, the aggregate production function. I construct what I call an aggregate distribution function, which is this ecosystem of policies that affect these main dimensions of household living standards, such as employment opportunity and entrepreneurial opportunity, disposable income, the affordability and availability of material necessities, economic securities, the ability of a household to withstand adverse economic shocks, and environmental security. There's a whole ecosystem of policies in each of those 5 domains, which is the de facto living standards diffusion mechanism within market economies. Or you could call it, in a little bit more colloquial terms, the underlying income distribution system in economies. The debate tends to focus on this or that item, but the dots are not connected. It's not viewed as a function, as an ecosystem generally. And economics, if it wants to remain as relevant as it can be in the 21st century, when inequality, environmental degradation, and fragility, the lack of resilience, is increasingly top of mind for the body politic, it needs to begin to treat this explicitly and systematically, and that's what I lay out, a set of concepts and tools for enabling them to do so. And if we do this better, then I think we're going to have a better prospect of addressing those social concerns and creating a better environment for the flourishing of the liberal tradition here, which I know is important for this institution. And I think the failure to address this half of economics, this half of the operating system for economics, this second lens that Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Alfred Marshall were looking at economies through, is really one of the main reasons the liberal tradition is taking on water in this century.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what are the implications of just going along with steady as you go without addressing this fundamental change? And you suggested in your book that it's perhaps the multilateral system that is really at stake. That's pretty profound.
Yeah, I don't think it's an overstatement to suggest the danger in this regard. Yes, of course, there are all sorts of debates and controversy over immigration, identity. There's geopolitical competition out there, no doubt. But what's interesting and worrying is that you see at countries of every level of economic development, across all sorts of political philosophies and systems, this same struggle right now to respond to the common aspirations of their people in the area of improving their lived experience, their living standard. Sustainable development, as it's called in the international lingo, if you will. And I think that economists are not doing a service to the policymakers, the politicians they advise, if they're bringing to the table this mental model that's only seeing half of the playing field. And I think if we continue to do that, we're likely to store up even further trouble for peace and stability, for the the importance of the liberal tradition, human rights, tolerance, and the rule of law and the rest. Because if you thought that globalization and digitization, the IT revolution, created a lot of churn and upheaval in economies and has really been roiling politics in the last 20 years, if you take a look at artificial intelligence and what people are beginning to expect there, and climate change regulation, these are going to be also very, very disruptive forces in economies. And so we need to catch up and do a better job, have a better mental model of how to look at the problem and what tools are available to address it. If we want to serve, when I say we, the economics community wants to serve humanity better in this century.
Yeah, when we look at the reports and the statistics that come out from Freedom House, for example, on the state of democracy in the world and how the line is going in a negative direction. The World Justice Project with the Rule of Law Index is similarly showing a decline in confidence, public confidence in the rule of law. Well, that's really disturbing. And what you're suggesting is that if we don't pay attention to these human-centered economic issues, that we're not going to turn around that curve, because otherwise we're seeing promises made but not kept, or objectives set but not met.
I think that's right, and so this may sound a bit abstract to viewers up to this point, but I do get into the book about how to operationalize this. What does it really mean? So, if economists are used to thinking about an output gap. In other words, how far below the growth potential of an economy is it running currently, and why? And that remains a valid consideration and focus. But what I've constructed here is a way to think about a parallel, equally important gap that I call the social welfare gap of economies. If you look at the data, you see that countries at the same level of economic development in terms of their GDP per capita have widely varying performance on these key dimensions of household living standards. Why is that? Because they have different institutional approaches and different levels of institutional investment in the enablers of that, in these policy domains that I talk about. And so countries should be thinking about walking and chewing gum at the same time in their economic policy. They should be thinking about what they can do to reduce or narrow their output gap. At the same time, they should be thinking about how do they activate better this institutional and policy incentive ecosystem across these 5 dimensions of household living standards to narrow their welfare gap. Moreover, in many cases, including in this country, some of the best ways to durably narrow your output gap is to address weaknesses on the living standard side, on the sustainability, resilience, and social inclusion side of the ledger. And this should become a key mission for the international economic architecture going forward. And so I spent some time talking about that. I call it moving from the Washington consensus, which has been the basic paradigm here for 20, 30 years, about really much a production function strategy, I think of it as. It's how to improve market signals, improve macroeconomic discipline, promote openness, in order to expand the size of the economy, to have a dash for growth, if you will. But there is this other side, and so I say that basically what I'm describing is a Roosevelt consensus approach to growth and development, because the 2 presidents Roosevelt, one Republican, one Democrat, spearheaded about 8 decades of investment in the institutional dimensions of the social contract in this country, in these key domains of household living standards. And that strengthened the growth process, and it made it more resilient. And it widened the circle. It created basically this mass consumption middle class society. Again, it was a bipartisan endeavor in this country in this regard. That's the type of 2-lens approach to economic policy and growth and development that we need to get back to, and we need to update it for the current context of the digital economy, climate change challenge, and the rest. That Roosevelt consensus is the organizing logic or principle for doing what people have been calling for decades now, which is a new Bretton Woods, an adaptation and updating of the international architecture to current circumstances. That hasn't made much progress because it's never had a new organizing principle that would enable a rationale for a revised institutional architecture. I would submit that this approach does, for the reasons I've explained, and that has some very, very specific, profound implications in key areas, and I get into those. One is macroeconomic analysis and advice that's provided to countries around the world, particularly developing countries. Second is the international financial architecture, and we happen to be having this conversation just as the United Nations climate change negotiations in Dubai are reaching their climax, and one of the biggest stumbling blocks is finance. And here there are major implications in the book that I lay out as to how we could actually mobilize far greater amounts of finance for climate and sustainable development. And then there's a section also dealing with trade and technology governance changes that would flow from this alternative dual track way of looking at economies.
Well, we've talked about what we mean by human-centered economics, and we've talked about why it is important, and now you're getting into the how. What do you do about it? And I'd like to pursue that a little bit more, both on the national level and on the international level. And on the national level, what changes in a country's economic policy do you foresee? And more important, perhaps, is how can a country put that approach into practice and facing a variety of disincentives and looking for incentives that'll stimulate progress toward this internalized, robust social contract. Can you talk about that at the national level?
So, on the national level, I have something that I call the golden rule of human-centered economics, which is that countries, their governments, should be applying as much policy attention and investment on improving this institutional side of their economies, the thing that really matters for the living standards of nations, as they do on the production side of their economy. The thing, that is to say, the level of output, the GDP growth per se. That is a fundamental principle that would change the conversation and change the analysis within governments. Right now, these other issues, like I say, are they're addressed in a sort of episodic, ad hoc manner, more as a function of the political pressures that governments face, rather than as a whole ecosystem that needs to be treated as a function in economics, because it has an aggregate effect on the bottom line of what countries are seeking, which is an improvement in aggregate social welfare, I call it, or the median household living standards. That golden rule is a way to activate this. And as I said before, there are some tools you can use to do that by benchmarking yourself in these institutional domains to countries at your level, more or less, of economic development, similar level of GDP per capita. If you look at that, I have some reference ranges in the book in key areas of fiscal policy as well as key areas of decent work indicators, labor markets, social protection, and the like. And you see that this huge variation, which creates an opportunity to learn from peer countries. For example, the difference between the median on a given indicator and the 80th percentile is on the order typically of 50% to 300%. And the difference between the lowest performer and the median performer, again, this is among countries at the same level of economic development, it ranges from 3 to 6 times. Again, that suggests that policymakers have agency. It's not because they're too poor, or yes, they have different historical circumstances, they have different political traditions and systems, But the facts are, as yielded by this empirical analysis, that there's plenty of opportunity for every country to narrow its social welfare gap in this regard. And so that's the basic advice for national economic policy.
And the obstacles to trying to implement that kind of a national policy are what, just the fact that things are as they are and it's hard to move in a different direction? There's a momentum that keeps us in the same track for a long time? Or?
I would say fundamentally the obstacle has been a failure of imagination. It's been a path-dependent, outmoded mental model that basically sees only half the playing field in policy, as I say. And however, for many countries, there's a lack of resources, right? Building the institutional dimensions of your social contract, basically how a country pursues its values in terms of social inclusion, environmental sustainability, and human and systemic resilience, that does require resources. That requires fiscal space in particular. And for many countries, developing countries, that is limited. And so here there's a very important role for international cooperation and governance, which I'm happy to get into as well. There's some specific recommendations in that regard.
Yeah, I wanted to also ask at the international level really the same question. How does the focus on human-centered economics work in the context of international economic governance and international cooperation? The U.S. certainly has a major role in that field, and I wonder about your thoughts in general and also what you think the U.S. should be doing more and better in order to advance this completing part of the economic dimension.
A couple things I'll say, just to highlight from the book. I mean, one is, I know this institution works quite a bit on trade policy. And the one thing I would say for everybody, not just for colleagues here, is that people say, well, we need a better model of globalization. Well, that better model is going back to these first principles, which is that you got to look at the institutional deepening has to accompany the trade liberalization that goes on. If you really want inclusive trade outcomes, if you want trade to benefit people's living standards and thereby improve the base of political support in the country for its opening to and integration into the world economy, you got to invest domestically in these key domains that I lay out in the book. And way too often that Washington consensus mentality gave short shrift to that institutional investment domestically dimension of the model here. So the first step on the trade side is to recognize this, begin to frame trade integration, economic integration agreements, so that they are not solely about market access. They are about, yes, improving the signals by improving trade, opening markets, if you will, but at the same time strengthening the labor and social protection institutions, the skilling and education systems of countries, the underpinning infrastructure, if you will, and these other key areas that help ensure that the benefits of that added growth created by trade, improved market signals, actually does diffuse into living standards going forward. That's on the trade side, and there's some very specific proposals in that regard for opportunities to do so, not just in the WTO, but in bilateral and regional trade agreements where really most of the action is these days. Then I would like to spend a little bit of time on the international financial architecture. The U.S. remains fundamental to what the IMF and the multilateral development banks do in this regard. And I'm pleased to see that under this Treasury Secretary, you're beginning to see an awakening of how the U.S. could deploy those institutions much more effectively and much more at scale. But it's just the first steps, in my view. And let me tell you what I mean by this. Let's take the climate change discussions, which are happening this week, as an example. There's been this debate over the $100 billion a year figure that was set as a goal for what could be mobilized by rich countries for poor countries to support their climate change efforts, whether mitigation or adaptation. And it appears that maybe in the last calendar year, the international community, the advanced countries hit that number, but there's a lot of debate about that. But the need is so much greater than that. Everybody recognizes it, yet we're still having this little intramural discussion about whether we've met this relatively modest target in this regard. If we were serious about better activating the capital and the capabilities in the multilateral development banks and the IMF, it would be possible to treat the climate situation as a true crisis. And I lay out in the book some changes without asking Congress for any increase in U.S. bilateral aid or without asking any other country to increase their bilateral aid, just by better activating the investment that we have already made in these institutions over decades. It would be possible, without affecting the credit ratings of the multilateral development banks, it would be possible to mobilize about $2 trillion increase of funding for low and middle income countries, which is equivalent to about 3% of GDP and increased external flows to them for each of the next 7 years. That is the equivalent in terms of resource flow of the Marshall Plan, but for twice as long. The Marshall Plan did about the same amount of mobilization of resources for about 3.5 years or so, if you will. And that's all feasible by better using what's in the IMF and what exists in the MDBs. And maybe it would take too much time to get into the details of it. It's in the 6th chapter of the book. But I say this because I'm frustrated that the debate is still at this incremental stage, and it's becoming an increasing political liability for the U.S. and other countries that are trying to gather consensus and cohere the international community behind a viable strategy in this regard.
Yeah. I'm thinking back to what you said about trade, and I'm thinking that in the United States and in other countries, there's often a lot of popular suspicion that trade is not going to have those benefits to the ability of people living in the economy to have jobs, to have a role in participating in the society, but rather the benefits will go somewhere else. And you're suggesting that domestic investment in the social contract is one way to give credibility to the objectives of saying, let's try to expand trade as a way to increase the pie, and at the same time, we're making investments that show that you will benefit from that increase. Is that?
That's exactly right. I think that's what people instinctively want to see in their governments.
Yeah.
I know the social contract sounds like an abstract notion, but this book tries to take it seriously and then instrumentalize it, basically by framing it as these dimensions of household living standards and then identifying the key enabling policies and institutional features that drive them and say, look, you don't have to just let the chips fall where they may with this trickle-down assumption at the heart of liberal economics. You can be intentional about this as a country. And yes, in some cases, you've got to make some choices. It's not all easy, particularly for poor countries that lack fiscal space. But that's what the international architecture should be reoriented to do. And I would submit, particularly sitting here at a leading foreign policy and security think tank, I would submit by doing this would create much greater opportunity for commitment, the binding of countries to the liberal principles that are embedded in the UN Charter and in the kind of worldview that this country had when it set up those institutions after World War II. The adherence to that is also taking on water politically around the world right now. And I can't think of a better way to bind the vast number of developing countries out there whose primary political imperative is to improve the lot of their people in terms of their living standards. I can't think of a better way, long-term, to ensure the viability of what is sometimes called the liberal international order then mobilizing this major increase in investment in sustainable development in those countries through the institutions that have been created many years ago to do exactly that. This is not just a parlor game conversation among economists about the theory of economics. No, I believe that this is a central factor in what is going to determine the course of international relations over the course of the next several decades.
And do you see that it will be possible to gain the political support necessary for that kind of a shift in investment?
I'm cautious about this. I think you got to start somewhere, and I think what I've tried to do with this book is to sort of lay out the mental model challenge that we have. Narratives, mental models are extremely powerful in politics and international relations. And so I think that's a place to start. The next place is to say pragmatically, where's the money? Where can the money be found with the least amount of political cost? And so that's why I've looked at the reform of the institutions in these particular ways, because if we really wanted to take coal out of the system, if we really wanted to double research and development and deployment for renewable energy technologies, because if taking coal out is the biggest short-term thing we can do to help ensure that we have a chance for meeting the Paris Agreement goals, the best long-term strategies certainly got to be some improvements, further improvements in technology. We can do all of that. At the same time, we can open some fiscal space for developing countries to deal with their adaptation and mitigation. And they're becoming extremely cynical right now and very frustrated politically. And that feeds the difficulties that I think U.S. and diplomacy of many countries around the world to try to maintain some coherence and cohesion within the international community behind the multilateral system. The UN Secretary General has laid out in his report, Our Common Agenda, some admonitions and some strong messages about what needs to be done to preserve the multilateral system, given what's coming down the track at us. That's what's at stake here. And I believe that once people realize, A, that there is a way to think about this in a more constructive and effective way, and B, actually there are resources available to go a long, long way toward what particularly developing countries are looking for, I think then you have the basis for an effective strategy that would not only improve prosperity worldwide, it improve economic growth, not only its rate, but also its resilience, its sustainability. But it would also improve, I think, the goodwill, I think, among nations, because they're more in a common project, and they're not so much thinking in a negative-sum game dynamic the way it has appeared in trade policy recently, and it has appeared in respect of climate change, where we're just struggling to come up with the minimum amount that has been requested of countries to mobilize. Then all of a sudden you begin to see a virtuous circle, a positive game, some game vision of international, global development and relations going forward.
Yeah, well, when you say the liberal international order and the ideas that order embraces, there were big ideas and they achieved broad support. And it seems that broad support is now in some jeopardy, weakening, as you say, taking water. And that what you're suggesting here is an approach that can help to rebuild the capacity of these big ideas to achieve positive results on these big issues that we're confronting.
I think that's right. And fundamentally, I think we've been limited by our imagination. And also a certain sense of complacency. I think that the incremental nature of things and the reliance on long-term goals and targets, they're like political palliatives. They show you that we're responding to the problem, but it doesn't impress over time. Whereas a higher level of ambition, a different transformative vision of how you pull the world community together, both economically and politically, is what would change the dynamic here and would restore confidence in people in the future and in the system that's been painstakingly created, over the last 80 years or so, coming out of the ashes of World War II. I think that I remain optimistic about that, but I recognize it is not easy to change the course you're on. We've been thinking about economics in the same way now for about 100 years, and we've been, since the great financial crisis, involved in this process of very well-meaning, often quite important, but ultimately very incremental action. And we need a step change. And I'm optimistic that once we begin to see the numbers and see how we've departed from the origins of the field itself, we can begin to get on a better course.
Okay, well, we have a few minutes left, and I'd like to turn now to some questions if we have some from the audience, and I'll just look at them and see what we have here. One is that one of the viewers says that the basic assumption of economic theory is that more is better, and yet psychological research suggests that there's such a thing as enough. Once people have enough, then getting more is not improving anything. And is your approach something that addresses the more is better as the guiding principle of economics?
Yes, it addresses it frontally if you define more as better as solely productive output, GDP. The whole book is an argument to the contrary. And that's not to say growth is unimportant for a very poor country.
Yeah.
Unless you grow the size of the pie, it's hard for anybody to get a bigger piece of pie, right? But for countries that are aging and or wealthy, let's take Japan as an example, growth is much less the issue than it is these compositional and distributional issues, as your questioner suggests. And it's just that we have had a lopsided focus in the field of production to the detriment of looking at distributional considerations. And you could read the whole book as an effort to try to rebalance that, to look at production and distribution, or diffusion, I think is maybe a better word, in parallel. And that's what I interpret one would mean by saying, actually, enough, but qualified to say, what's the composition of enough? That's the real issue.
I have another question here by someone who talks about the Roosevelt consensus that you suggested, and asks whether that consensus aided in the post-war flourishing. The questioner says in the United States, but I might add, and globally, that we experienced in this period.
Absolutely. I like to say that if you were a Brit, you might call it the Beveridge consensus, because they had a report from Lord Beveridge there, which led to the build-out of some of their quote-unquote welfare state, if you will. Or you could call it the Nordic consensus, because Nordic economies are very much organized along these lines, very strong institutions in a number of these areas. I live currently in Switzerland. They have a very different way, as I was talking to you about before we began the session, of looking at regulation in a number of areas, where there are a number of things that they do, and the Nordics do, to help ensure that the middle class remains the bulk of the economy, and that its way of life, its lived experience progresses in time. Even if, there are certainly rich people, if you will, but they have a system for helping to diffuse the benefits of their wealth throughout the economy. So I call it the Roosevelt consensus because, well, I'm an American, but more than that, because they pioneered this in a very structured way over many decades, and it was bipartisan. It's not just TR and FDR. This went all the way up through the Nixon administration, where there were major investments in environmental and labor and occupational safety, and many different aspects of these things. And people understand the role that particularly FDR played in reconstructing the world order, and see what happened to build the American middle class and to build the country into an economic superpower. So I believe that nomenclature, or the Roosevelt consensus, captures well the distinction with the Washington consensus, which was much more of a neoliberal look at how you strengthen market signals.
Well, I don't see any more questions here, so let me just conclude with a personal question for you. You've held senior positions in various kinds of organizations. You were in the White House, National Security Council, United States Senate as a senior economist, and World Economic Forum, and a variety of other international bodies that you're familiar with. And I wonder now, as you sit in Geneva as Director of Research with the International Labor Organization, has that changed your perspective on these issues? And does it give you any particular insight that you haven't already conveyed from what is in the book?
You know, I've been lucky to have this very interdisciplinary experience. And you know, one of the things about being in a UN organization for the first time is that you see the multilateral system from the inside and the rights basis of it. I didn't emphasize it in this talk, but there is a whole rights-based understanding of what people can expect from their country's economy. The right to Social Security, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to safe drinking water. These are considered by states, and in fact they're legal commitments by states, as enabling universal rights, if you will. And that tradition, that rights-based tradition, has been like a ship passing in the night with the utility maximization worldview of traditional liberal economics. And in a way, being in a multilateral institution has given me an expanded appreciation of the weight of history and the weight of commitments legally. These things, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which Eleanor Roosevelt had such an important role in helping to facilitate, was about 20 years later enshrined in an international covenant for economic, social, and cultural rights. And so states have a legal commitment to the quote-unquote progressive realization of those universal economic and social rights. And I like to think of this book, and I think I never would have thought of it this way had I not been working at the International Labor Organization, as a structured attempt to reconcile the rights-based and sort of very clinical utility maximization perspectives on things. The other thing I would say in response to your question, Jim, is that part of my role has been to be Sherpa and the representative in the finance track of the G20 process. And I have, therefore, over the last few years, been part of the process and had a front row seat at the way that machinery works. I had a bit of this role. I was kind of the shoe Sherpa when it was the G8 many years ago at the end of the Clinton-Gore Administration. But that has instilled in me a further desire to write this book because despite the very good intentions and tangible accomplishments of the G20 in recent years, they are modest relative to what is being expected by societies right now. And that has also been a part of my current experience that I think has fed into the book in some meaningful way.
Well, it's a terrific book, as I said at the beginning, and you have certainly made the case that human-centered economics and paying attention to the living standards as an integral part of economic policy and practice is really important for a better future. And so, again, congratulations on the book. I hope people will read it, and where can they find it? Where can they get a hold of this book?
This book is published by Palgrave Macmillan, one of the major academic publishers, and we have made it open access, the ebook version of it, or you can just go to Amazon or many of the other booksellers, their websites, and order it from there.
Okay, so if you like to have your hands on a book, You go to Amazon. If you just want to read it online, it's online and available without cost.
Yes, indeed.
That's tremendous. Well, congratulations and thank you for spending this hour with us.
Thank you very much. And thanks to you, Jim, for having a great conversation today.